Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. This is Agnes Worsbicki from the United Nations Environment Program, or UNEP's Regional Office for Latin America and the Caribbean. I would like to welcome all of you to our webinar on shaping the future through sustainable pulp procurement, green building considerations. This is the third and final webinar of a small series of webinars on sustainable pulp procurement as part of the knowledge dissemination activities of a joint UNEP and OECS Commission initiative called Strengthening Sustainable Pulp Procurement in the OECS. Now, this particular webinar has been organized in collaboration with the Caribbean Development Bank and the Organization of American States in its capacity as the technical secretariat of the Inter-American Network on Government Procurement, or the INGP. So the purpose of the webinar is to provide a general introduction to green building considerations for public procurement in the context of the Caribbean. And for this, we are pleased to have with us today three esteemed panelists who will be sharing with us their insights into various aspects of green building considerations, from sustainable energy solutions to eco-labels and standards, as well as key takeaways from the first net zero energy building in the Caribbean. Professor Anthony Clayton, Dr. Roland R. Clark, and Josh Jacobs will all be properly introduced a little bit later by our moderator, Doug Fraser, Head of Procurement from the Caribbean Development Bank. So before we jump into the webinar, I just have a couple of quick housekeeping remarks. First, as you probably noted, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording as well as the presentations will be shared with everyone on the One Planet Network website and the website of the INGP. And you can see links to those websites at the bottom of the slide. In addition, we would love to hear from you throughout the webinar. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to type in your question or comment in the question box at the bottom of your screen, or you can also click on the hand icon to raise your hand. We will have a dedicated segment at the end of the panel discussion where the moderator will be taking questions from the audience, but also we could take questions from the audience even earlier. So feel free to engage in the discussion at any time. So to kick off the webinar, we have a couple of quick opening remarks from colleagues. We'll first be hearing from Roland Palmer, representing UNEP, followed by Helena Fonseca, representing the OAS and the INGP Technical Secretariat. So without further ado, I would now like to invite Rowan to the virtual podium. Rowan is a program management officer at UNEP's Resources and Markets branch in Geneva. He leads the Sustainable Infrastructure Partnership, which aims to promote and build capacity for integrated approaches to sustainable infrastructure development. Rowan, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Agnes. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, depending on where you're joining from. I'd first like to thank the organizers for the invitation to speak today, and I'd like to start things off by zooming out a little bit from the specific focus of this event, which is green buildings, and talk a bit about sustainable infrastructure in general. There is a tendency, I think, to think about sustainable public procurement in relatively narrow terms in terms of greening government operations, which is of course important, but sustainable public procurement policies and practices need to extend to large-scale infrastructure investments as well, because infrastructure assets are some of the biggest ticket items that governments procure, and these procurement choices have long-lasting sustainability impacts because the lifespan of most infrastructure assets is measured in decades, and the type of infrastructure systems that we build determine to a large extent the sustainability of our economic and social activities over that time frame. We know about the importance of infrastructure for the SDGs. Research by our partners at UNOPS and Oxford University shows that infrastructure in all sectors influences 92% of the 169 SDG targets across all 17 of the SDGs. And so for those influences on SDGs to be positive, the infrastructure that we build over the next 10, 20, 30 years needs to be much more sustainable than the infrastructure we've built over the last 100 years. And here, public procurement has an important role to play because of its power to transform markets. And when it comes to infrastructure, that power is significant because despite the growing importance of the private sector in infrastructure development, governments are still the primary planners and financiers of infrastructure projects. About 60 to 65% of the cost of infrastructure in developing and emerging economies is covered by the public sector, and in advanced economies, it's about 40%. And so that means that governments have the opportunity to be leaders in adopting sustainable procurement practices that can provide signals for and influence the actions of not just other investors, but all stakeholders across the infrastructure lifecycle. And since governments are responsible for creating the policies and regulations and institutions for integrating sustainability into infrastructure development, they're also very well placed to try and make sure that these priorities are reflected in procurement decisions. And so this means making sure that the full value of the social and environmental benefits of infrastructure across its entire lifespan is captured in procurement decisions. And this is particularly critical for infrastructure investments because the primary objective of almost all infrastructure is, in one way or another, to provide public services that are essential for health and human well-being and social and economic development. And this last point brings me back to the topic at hand, public procurement of green buildings. New research on COVID recovery policies by the Oxford University Economic Recovery Project has identified green building upgrades as one of the most effective types of investments for driving economic recovery from the pandemic. They create a lot of local, relatively low-skilled jobs. They have high economic multiplier effect and can make significant contributions to overall greenhouse gas emission reductions. But incidentally, the same study found that while over $14 trillion in recovery spending was committed around the world in 2020, less than 20% of that recovery spending has been allocated towards green initiatives. For example, since the pandemic began, G20 governments have committed almost $600 billion to support different types of energy development, but 40% of this is still directed towards fossil fuels. And so this shows us that we have a lot of work ahead of us if we are going to change course. And of course, sustainable public procurement policies have a huge role to play in this change. They really play a role in making sure that policy translates into on-the-ground impacts. And so when it comes to infrastructure investments, which tend to be large and long-lasting, the stakes are incredibly high. And so on that note, I wish you all a productive rest of this meeting on this really important topic, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Rowan, for that really great introduction to sustainable infrastructure. I think it provides a great context for our discussion where we hone in on green building considerations. I would now like to give the floor to Helena Fonseca. Some of you may know Helena from her work as a specialist at the Department for Effective Public Management of the Organization of American States, which serves as the Technical Secretariat of the Inter-American Network on Government Procurement, or INGP. Helena, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Agnes. Good morning, good afternoon to all the colleagues from the UNEP, the OECD's Secretariat, Caribbean Bank, representative of the OEA's Caribbean Permanent Missions, and all the speakers and participants of this webinar. Welcome. Before beginning my opening remark, on behalf of the Organization of American States, we would like to stand in solidarity with the people and government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines and other island countries for the impact caused by the eruption of the La Sofer volcano. We really wish them an early recovery and rehabilitation. Such natural disasters allow us to reflect, particularly during this month, which we celebrate the Earth Day, on the need to connect our actions with the impact that we want to cause on the environment through more sustainable practices and the strengthening of resilience of countries to address these actions in a more effective way. The title of this webinar said it well. Today, we should build the future through practices that provides more sustainable scenarios. And part of this is the need to build public works that, for instance, optimize existing natural resources, respect ecological principles, and take into consideration the environment so as not to cause adverse effects in the communities. Generating this sustainable impact means to rethink what is contracted and what type of goods, services, or infrastructure are acquired to not only satisfy needs, but to create a real value that produce impact for benefit of the society. So in this sense, public procurement should be a strategic tool that ensures the access to citizens' rights such as quality of life, a healthy environment, among other related rights, and that are directly linked to the fulfillment of the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. And if we talk about the future, according to the International Labour Organization statistics, green building will generate more than 6.5 billion jobs by 2030, which means that it's a sector with great growth projection for green employment. So sustainability not only involves the environmental component, but goes hand in hand with other components such as social and economic. And in terms of efficiency, it's important not to focus only on the high expenditure generated in the short term, but to project it's all as an investment in savings and positive impact in the medium and long term. We know that this is a huge challenge for governments. Therefore, there is still a need to continue developing awareness efforts and promoting regulatory and institutional reforms to break paradigms and invest in the impact and not only in the good and service we acquire of the work we build. These spaces for dialogue allow us to listen and learn new perspective, to learn from others and to redesign current practices in order to influence changes from the institutional work that we are doing. Therefore, I encourage all attendants not only to be agents who receive these new trends, but also to act as agents of change. This implies leaving our daily comfort zones and making decisions and taking coordinated actions from the different roles and entities in order to enhance efforts and advance results. I would like to take this opportunity, as always, to sincerely thank our colleagues from the UNEP, CDB, and the OECS Secretariat for the collaborative work carried out in recent months, which has enabled us not only to exchange experiences and lessons learned about sustainable public procurement, but also to increase awareness and knowledge of government officials in OECS countries in order to strengthen their capacity building to implement sustainable public procurement. I would like to also thank the speakers participating in today's webinar for their refreshing perspective and expertise in how to promote green infrastructure. From the OEAS, we will continue supporting this vision as INGP Technical Secretariat and strengthen our alliance so that from a holistic approach, we can continue to contribute to the improvement of the institutional capacity of procurement agencies in order to strengthening the institutional capacities of the region's procurement agencies, again, to achieve a scaling up their practices and sustainable approaches for greater impact. So thank you very much, Agnes.
Thank you, Helena, for setting the scene for us and also for highlighting the very important concept of value for money, which underpins sustainable public procurement. I would also like to thank you, Helena, and your organization for all of your support in the knowledge dissemination and capacity building activities that have been part of our Strengthening Sustainable Public Procurement in the OECS initiative. So I would now like to turn the floor over to Doug Fraser. Doug, as I have already mentioned, is the Caribbean Development Bank's head of procurement, and he manages the procurement policy unit within the bank's projects department based in Barbados. Doug will be introducing our esteemed panelists today, and he will be leading us in the panel discussion. Doug, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Agnes. Could you just confirm you can hear me clearly?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly well.
Excellent. Well, good morning, everybody. As Agnes has said, I'm Doug Fraser, and it's an absolute pleasure to be moderating this session this morning. On behalf of CDB, I would like to thank UNEP and OAS for all the efforts they have made in moving this agenda forward and in organizing these webinar series. And I thank you, all the attendees, for being here today and taking time out of your busy schedule. I'd also like to echo the sentiments of Elena, that our thoughts and prayers are very much with the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines at this time. We, in this panel session, are going to look at some of the more practical elements of green building considerations in the context of procurement. And I have an excellent selection of panelists here with me this morning. And I have to say, UNEP and OAS have done an excellent job in putting these panelists together. So with us this morning, and perhaps the panelists could just give a little wave as I introduce them, we have Professor Anthony Clayton, who is an Ackland Professor of Caribbean Sustainable Development at the University of the West Indies. He's a visiting professor at the Centre for Environment and Sustainability in the School of Engineering at the University of Surrey, an affiliated scholar at the Jack Gordon Institute for Public Policy within the Stephen Green School of International and Public Affairs at Florida International University, a fellow of the Caribbean Academy of Sciences, a fellow of the World Academy of Sciences, co-chair of the Energy Committee of the Inter-American Network of Academies of Science, and chairman of the Broadcasting Commission of Jamaica. He is joined by Dr. Roland R. Clark, waving at you now, who is an independent sustainable energy consultant and the director of Clark Energy Incorporated, a registered corporation in Barbados since 2008. He has more than 30 years of experience in energy policy, renewable energy, energy efficiency, electric utilities, and capacity building. And he's the author of the 2020 Green Building Procurement Manual and Toolkit for Public Sector Managers for the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center in Belize. And we're going to hear a little bit more about that later. So welcome, Dr. Clark. And they're joined by Mr. Josh Jacobs. If you could give us a wave, thank you. Who's the Director of Environmental Codes and Standards for UL's Environment and Sustainability Division. In this role, he helps develop and track the environmental rating system, standard codes, purchasing programs that have been utilized throughout the world. As a lead, AP Plus and BDC, Josh has served on over 30 sustainably focused committees, including but not limited to ASHRAE 189.1 Lead Steering Committee, USGBC's Pilot Credit Committee, and served on the Water IEQ Work Group. And you're going to hear a little bit more about what all those acronyms actually mean shortly. He's also developed the first public draft of the IGCC. So welcome to all three of our panelists. And I think we can certainly say we have the right people in the virtual room. Just to echo what Agnes was saying earlier, you're very welcome at any point to drop questions in the box. Raise your hands. I will try to keep an eye on that, and we will bring in relevant questions at the appropriate point. To kick things off, we thought we'd try to bring as many of you into an interactive poll exercise just to start proceedings. And I'm going to try and put the first poll question on the screen. One second. Could somebody confirm that that's viewable?
I can see it, Doug.
Wonderful. Thanks, Agnes. So just to kick things off, we're talking about green buildings. We want to help shape the discussions. We'd like you to think about, within that definition of green buildings, which of the following would apply? And please select all of those that would apply. So anybody in the audience, please feel free to add your thoughts. We'll just keep this open for a very short time, given the time constraints we're working under. I can see responses are coming in. I'll just give you a few more seconds and then I'll close it so we could all see the outcome. All right, just 10 more seconds. I can see you're still hard at work in the audience. A couple more seconds. All right, I'm going to close the poll now and hopefully publish the findings on the screen. All right, I'm going to try and share the outcome of that. Agnes, could you confirm again that that's viewable?
Yes, I can see it, Doug.
My IT skills seem to be higher than I anticipated. So we have responses on the screen here across. Really, in most instances, you've felt all of these areas are aspects of green buildings. I'd like to just throw this open to our esteemed panelists at this point, because I'd like to hear their views on what is a green building in the context of this discussion. So panelists, if you could have a quick reflection and feedback from each of you.
Sure, if I may. The only thing there that I'm a little surprised at is the relatively low turnout for a structural design, which I think is actually very important. But I'll go on to say a little bit more about that in my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Clayton. Other panelists? Dr. Clark, did you want to come in? Or Mr. Jacobs, could I call upon you?
Doug, I believe Josh Jacobs is muted. Perhaps we can't hear him.
Okay, and I'll come back to Dr. Clark because perhaps he was having the same problem.
No, so Doug, yeah, I just got unmuted. Thank you, Agnes. You had muted us on your end. So, Doug, for me, this is encouraging from a standpoint that it looks like most people, at least 75%, selected almost all of them, right? Because all of these fit into a green building. The one thing I'd love to mention is the first four are done beforehand for the most part. And the last one, building operation and maintenance, is the lowest because we think, oh, once we've given everyone a green building, it's great. When we, the humans who operate and own and live and work in a building, are typically sustainability's worst enemy. So I promise you, building operation and maintenance is a huge part of green buildings. that you have a lot of control. If you're handed over a green building, we need to keep ensuring that it continues as a sustainable building.
Thank you very much. And I think in previous discussions just between the panelists, actually, Professor Clayton had some quite frightening figures of the extent of emissions from the operations of buildings. And I'm
Yes, I do, and I'll share those shortly, Doug. But just to endorse that last point, when we were doing some preliminary work, and this was at my own university, the University of the West Indies, we found a number of people, and these are educated people who are aware of the issues, who used to sit in their office with the air conditioning running because they like the room to be nice and cool, and the window wide open because they also liked a bit of fresh air. And of course, we had to point out that what they're trying to do was cool the planet, which was really quite a difficult task. So yes, changing people's awareness of what's involved in actually operating a building is another very important point.
Thank you, Professor. And Dr. Clark, I apologize. I think I had done the same to you, also muted you. Would you like to come in?
This is Roland Clark. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Please proceed.
Excellent. Well, from my perspective, I am much more at the operational level in respect to green procurement. So therefore, I am concerned with the building systems. In turning to buildings that consume energy, I'm concerned about product safety. How recyclable are these products? What are some of the end-of-life issues? And I'm also very concerned from the perspective of a procurement officer about the concept of value for money on an overall life cycle basis. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And as I think we're seeing from a number of the speakers there, we're looking at an end-to-end concept here, a full life cycle, if you will. I just want to move on to another poll before we move to a little bit more detail from the presenters, who I know are itching to get going. I'm going to try to launch a second poll, and this is more about to seek some feedback from you, the audience, as to what green building public procurement might look like in your current context. Is that viewable?
Yes, Doug, I can see it. This is Agnes.
Okay, so if I could just ask the audience to give us some feedback on what areas your public procurement focuses on in terms of green building procurement, if it does at present. And there is we fully recognize that a lot of countries are still moving forward in this particular aspect, which is, of course, why this particular initiative was originally designed. So I can see some of the results are coming in. I'm going to keep this one pretty tight because, as I've said, we've got a quite aggressive timeline. Just 10 seconds more, please. Okay. I'm going to close this one out. And I'm going to try and share the findings. So I think, as we suggested, a number of the countries are still at quite an early stage in looking at the green building concept within public procurement. But those who are integrating into their public procurement seem to be primarily at the moment looking at the designs and technical requirements and the choice of materials and systems, although also evaluation criteria and life cycle costing are coming into play, which is good to see. And I think we're going to see some of these aspects now brought out in the feedback we get from our panelists. So I'm going to hide this poll. And at this point, I'm going to turn over to Dr. Roland Clark to ask us to give us some feedback on his experiences. And he's going to speak in particular about his experiences of preparing the Green Building Procurement Manual and Toolkit for public sector managers for the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. Dr. Clark, over to you. Let me just unmute you. I'm having a challenge actually unmuting you at present. Okay, I believe you're unmuted now, Dr. Clark. Sorry about that.
Okay, would Agnes give me control of the screen? Sorry, would Agnes give me control of the screen, please?
Just one moment. Just one moment. Okay, we can see your screen now, Roland.
Excellent. Okay, so the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center in Belize commissioned the preparation of a green building procurement manual. That manual and its associated toolkit was published last September, and I was retained as the author for that assignment. The objective of this presentation is as follows: to introduce the green building manual, the toolkit, and gather some feedback. Here's the front page of the manual. This is what it looks like. And why is it necessary to develop this particular green building manual? Well, in the past, if you look at past experience, we've had several energy audits done that focus on large energy consuming systems such as air conditioning and lighting. However, there's this potential that has been ignored. You have these purchasing managers making everyday decisions about office equipment, all kinds of things. Some of them are also involved with some of the larger equipment as well. And they have not really had any guidance. So this is the innovation that we are trying to introduce here. We have this operational definition, therefore, of green building procurement for CARICOM. And this is based on a review of procurement policies in 5 CARICOM countries, together with the CARICOM Secretariat, the Caribbean Development Bank, and also the CARICOM Regional Organizations for Standards. Here we look at the issue of energy, product safety, recyclability of energy systems, and the concepts of value for money. The manual gives guidance on how procurement officials may organize their green building processes and introduces a concept of a wider committee. In the past, procurement managers have acted alone. Now we are suggesting that perhaps they should operate within, within a committee framework. The manual gets down to some really nitty-gritty details concerning standards for product safety. And in particular, here's an interesting one, something called the PV cycle for solar photovoltaic systems. This has to do with the end-of-life issue. This is a new initiative, not fully developed, but that is something that one should look for. The manual gives a detailed mapping of the requirements of the 2018 CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code. The requirements of that building code are mapped to the equipment defined by only the Energy Star label in the United States, so that one could have the regional building code as our baseline. The Energy Star label guides us in terms of the energy efficient case, and we can do an impact analysis and a post-impact analysis. The manual also touches on water efficiency, and it gives a survey of environmental sustainability labels. Some certification marks include for product safety. These may look familiar to you. CE, Conformity European, that is actually published out of France. The CSA is Canadian. TUV is out of Germany. There's a TUV North, there's a TUV South. Underwriters Laboratory, Underwriters Laboratory is represented here with us today. And then the NCS is an interesting one out of the United Kingdom in that it drills down to the level of even installers and the quality of installations. Here are some of those certification marks. Some of them may look familiar to you already. And PV cycle, again, there's a little bit of discussion here about that. Now, that mapping that the manual introduces, here's an example of a specification table which is inside the manual. On the left-hand side, you have the requirements of the Regional Energy Building Code, which are aimed at both residential system as well as commercial. So table by table are identified. A page number is given. The C is for commercial. I must say that the manual which was developed for commercial systems only. It just so happened that you know, in our comparison with Energy Star, we find that for this thing called building envelope, we don't have any R values for things for the commercial sector, but there are certain R values, that is resistance values, for insulated and uninsulated attic spaces. Of course, we took the numbers for the tropical parts, Florida, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, etc. Here's a recommendation that is written into the manual, suggesting to the procurement officers that they should also always go for higher and higher values, but subject to considerations of budget as well as space. Here's what the CARICOM Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code looks like. It was prepared by the CARICOM Regional Organization for Standards of Quality, CrossQ, together with the Code Council and ASHRAE, the American Association for Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers. Now, after the manual was in fact completed, CrossQ itself issued a label for CARICOM. It's very, very nice, very, very interesting. Here, if you take a look at the one to the left, this one is for refrigerators and freezers. It gives grades A, B, and C. This particular product gets a grade B, so that helps to guide the decision makers and even the consumers. There's a price say for operating costs. Of course, that will have to be tailored to each local country. But what is most important are the kilowatt hours. That would be pretty standard across our region. The cost would be different depending on local energy costs. There's also lighting, which is covered here, and there are quite a few more. Very interesting. Accompanying the manual is a toolkit, the Green Building Procurement Manual Policy and Procedures for Public Managers. There's an overview of the national policies for procurement for 5 CARICOM countries: Antigua and Barbuda, Belize, Grenada, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines. The toolkit provides the details of the life cycle analysis method, suggesting some online software tools. In particular, we identify a software tool delivered by Harvard University. The analysis method, life cycle analysis method, comes from Stanford University. There's also a product pricing database. There's the Granger database and the means database. These are, really big fat documents that could be obtained free of cost. And then, of course, local decision makers can then map the prices that they see in those manuals to the prices that they see locally. And of course, the product specification tables that were highlighted earlier for the manual, they are also contained in the toolkit as well for repetition purposes. So in summary, procurement managers are indispensable to saving energy. We have known this for some time, but we have not, in my industry, not done very much to include them in the key decisions. We suggest a committee approach. The procurement managers do need some support. And, we need to do those pre and post impact analyses to see how well we are doing, to see how markets have been transformed, to derive any learning consequences. The manual suggests the use of existing labels, whether it's the Energy Star label, for example. There's now the new CARICOM Regional Energy label by CrossQ. End-of-life issues are becoming more and more important. In the case of photovoltaics, nobody purchases photovoltaic panels based on what happens at the end of the life, what happens to the landfill, how do we dispose, but that is soon coming in, into vogue. We urge, therefore, that you use the Green Building Manual to guide your considerations of energy systems in buildings. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clark, for that insightful presentation. Just a quick question. In terms of the manual, the associated toolkit and the online resources, how would participants access those?
Okay, the manual has been published. There's a PDF version and there's a hard copy version of the manual. In the manual itself, there are several URLs given to the online resources. And then, of course, the committee will provide the technical expertise to help the procurement managers do the savings impact analyses.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions coming through, and I'll also, after that, invite fellow panelists to chime in.
Doug, I'm sorry,
go ahead.
Doug, I just wanted to mention that the manual and the toolkit, they're both posted on the INGP website, and we're also in the process of posting it on the One Planet website. So I will share that link with all the registered participants of the webinar as a follow-up.
Excellent. Thank you, Agnes, because I think that's important resource material for the participants today. Dr. Clark, a couple of questions coming through. One of them is in relation to your last slide. It's asking about how the disposal of equipment is factored into the methodology, and I know you did touch on that in the final slide. And second question, if public procurement officials are looking to implement this toolkit, this manual, do you have any recommendations in regards to a phased approach to slowly phasing it in?
Okay, the first question relates to
disposal.
Yeah,
end of life.
Yeah, in the approach taken by the manual, emphasis was placed on existing standards, accepted methods. And certainly in the case of photovoltaic, no such method or standard exists today. There has been an initiative that started in 2013 in the United Kingdom. It is currently under consideration by the European Union. But because no standard exists, that doesn't mean that these factors cannot be taken into consideration during, say, an environmental impact assessment. That could be a requirement of an environmental impact assessment of a large photovoltaic or a large wind turbine power system that the installers do consider and give us a plan. In some cases, there are, in fact, some manufacturers who will tell you that they will come in and remove their panels at the end of life. That is 20, 25 years down the road. That makes the presumption that they are still in business at that point in time. So therefore, it is important that the governments themselves really do take care of this particular issue, not necessarily rely on the manufacturers. In terms of the phase approach, this has to be voluntary. That's a tough one. That will have to be done on a case-by-case basis. But I think there should be a certain degree of hand-holding at the national level, and this is where the committees come into place. You have some very enthusiastic people in the energy divisions of countries, the environmental divisions, and the standards divisions. I will start with them. I will use their
Dr. Clark. I think we may have lost Dr. Clark for a minute. I don't know, while we're waiting to regain the connection, I don't know if other panelists would like to come in.
Yeah, Doug, this is Josh. The interesting thing is when I get to my presentation, it's not minimizing Dr. Clark's focus, because obviously it's incredibly important on the operational side and that savings, but it's also this embodied carbon concept, and they can start to work together. He had mentioned the Energy Star program in the US. The Energy Star program has been focused on that operational carbon and minimizing the amount that our appliances use, and even giving ratings to entire buildings and things of that nature, and that's incredibly important. There's now discussion that the US federal government could expand Energy Star to account for how much energy it takes to save energy, right? So how much energy does it take to actually create a solar panel? How much energy does it need to create a dishwasher that actually ends up saving you energy? And are these things actually saving energy over their lifetime? It's an interesting conversation that I'll touch on a little bit in a couple slides.
Okay, fantastic. I'm sure Dr. Clark will rejoin us shortly, but at this point, I would suggest we move on to Professor Clayton. And I know, Professor Clayton, I know you're going to speak to us a little bit about your experiences with the zero net energy building case study.
I am. Thank you very much, Doug, and thank you, Agnes. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to follow the pattern that's already been established and give you a little bit of background first. By the time we reach 2050, world's population is projected to be somewhere in the range 9 to 10 billion. That's about a third more than today. And we're also seeing continued urban drift, migration. So we think the total proportion of humanity that will be living in urban settlements will be up from about 55% today to maybe 75%. If you do the math on this, what it means is we're going to need the equivalent of 3 or 4 new cities a year, every year, for the next 30 years. Each one the size that Mexico City is today, i.e. population over 20 million. Now, in practice, excuse me, these probably won't be new mega cities. There'll be peri-urban developments and mid-sized cities, but nonetheless, we're going to have a great deal more urban development. As a result, by the time, again, we get to 2050, we're projected to be consuming about 30% more water than we are now, 50% more energy, 70% more food, and 100% more materials. We'll be going up from 80 gigatons of materials a year to closer to 160 gigatons. And about half of that increase will be the sand, the cement, the gravel, the steel that we need for all these new buildings. Big challenges: are we going to survive the transition to this future? We have to be asking very difficult questions like, is the projected increased demand for materials actually sustainable? And of course, the major factor now, climate change. At present, most recent estimates says that we are on track to be somewhere like 3.2 degrees centigrade warmer by the end of the century. If we continue down that road, parts of the planet's surface could become uninhabitable. About a third of the Antarctic ice sheets are potentially susceptible to collapse. Large parts of the Middle East becoming too hot and arid to survive. Significant parts of countries like Bangladesh underwater, and many of our coastal cities flooded. So what we actually face now is 2 very highly divergent outcomes. One is we continue with the current pattern of economic development, building and so forth, in which case we probably take climate change past the point at which remedial action is possible. Alternatively, we make a decision. We make a transition to much more energy and resource efficient modes of urban living, including things like net zero buildings, autonomous vehicles, and a rapid transition to renewable energy sources, renewable and low carbon. The reason why we need a particular focus on buildings is that building construction and use combined are responsible for over a third of global final energy consumption and nearly 40% of total CO2 emissions. So if we look at ways of making our buildings more efficient, both in construction and use, we can actually go a far way to solving the problems of the climate change. And of course, we will end up with a built environment which is much cheaper to operate which will give increased levels of disposable income, which will support growth in other sectors of the economy. So this is one of the few areas that is actually genuinely win-win. Now, in the search for solutions, we have to focus in particular on tropical and subtropical regions, because that is where most of the population growth and urban migration will be, and that is where the new cities will be. Now, this is technically challenging because it is harder to keep the interior of a building cool and dry in a hot and humid climate than it is to keep it warm in a cold climate. So we set out to solve this problem by building a net zero energy building, which we did. It was the first in Jamaica, the first in the Caribbean, one of the very first in the world in the tropics and subtropical regions. A net zero energy building is one that can generate all the power that it consumes. There is also a category above that, Energy Plus, where the building generates more than it consumes, at which point, of course, the building is working for you because you're then selling power to others. If we could make every building from now on net zero, we could actually shut down many of the world's power stations, which would take us a far way to solving our problems with climate change. We didn't invent the concept. This was an existing net zero energy building in Seattle. This building here, you see the large solar roof, is actually generating as much power as it consumes. The building is designed to be highly energy efficient so that the roof can in fact generate as much power as the building's residual demand. This goes back now 13 years. This is a solar village in Freiburg in Germany. These are Energy Plus. These are net exporting power back to the grid. So we certainly didn't invent the concept. But like I said, this is the first in the Caribbean. This is a net zero building designed to be highly energy efficient. Although you can't see it, the solar roof is actually generating more power than the building consumes. Now, this may change because at the moment, the COVID-19 pandemic has effectively shut down the university campus. So we can't tell for sure until we're back into normal patterns of use. But at the moment, this building is actually Energy Plus. It's generating more power than it consumes. Our key findings were that some of the most effective ways to make a building more energy efficient and get closer to NZEB or Energy Plus cost little or nothing. One of the most effective things that we found you can do is orient the building to the sun. Now, almost all the development in the Caribbean at the moment, we put the building parallel to the road, which means that you don't take into account the gain from the sun. By orienting to the sun, you can go a far way towards reducing unwanted heat gain and improving the efficiency of the solar panels. Second thing you can do is an internal reorganization. Put the living spaces in the interior, service areas on the outside walls. Now, simply by rejigging the internal layout, you can keep the living spaces much cooler. And then thinking about building design to maximize, oops, sorry, I jumped ahead too quickly, in ways that you can, I'm so sorry, maximize natural light for illumination and use natural ventilation. So really quite simple zero or low cost changes in layout and design can go a far way to reducing the waste of energy. But I do want to emphasize this, you cannot set out to solve just one problem at a time. This is not just an engineering issue. You have to also take into account that every country has got building regulations. These specify minimum standards, and there are very few or no government regulations aimed at net zero buildings. There are some exceptions, but none in the Caribbean. UK, for example, has done this. I believe some states in the US are moving towards this. So the precedent exists, but we need to see incorporation of this idea into building regulations and minimum standards as in every part of the world. Third issue is simply education. Architects and contractors do not currently know how to design and build NZ buildings. This is not a huge problem, but nonetheless, it's a critical information gap. It's one we have to address. Fourth issue is demand, market demand, because if people don't know the difference between a building that costs nothing to operate and a conventional, sorry, in energy terms, and a conventional building, then there won't be market demand. So you have to prime the market. Fifth issue is the fiscal system. taxes on imports of particular technologies makes them less attractive. And so it's important to persuade governments to look at our systems of taxes to make some imports low tax or zero tax in order to encourage this transition. And finally, the utility, the grid, plays a very important part in determining whether Energy Plus is actually economically attractive. All Caribbean countries have a monopoly grid because the islands are too small to support grid competition. So if the monopoly grids offers you a very low price for the electricity that they're purchasing, that's a complex area which we can come back to in the discussion if you wish. But if they offer a low purchase price, it makes the idea of selling power from your building less viable, much less attractive. And the spread right now in Jamaica is their costs of buying from the grid are high. Costs of value, the price you get if you sell to the grid is extremely low. It's a very large spread. The grid is not currently very interested in encouraging this development. So this is where governments again maybe have to play a role. But most construction, what we've achieved in building a net zero building in Jamaica is not the entire solution to the problem. Most construction in the Caribbean is based on cement and steel. And these are industries that are very high contributors, so a couple of the biggest contributors to oil carbon emission. In fact, they're second only to the fossil fuel industry. Now, this is the problem. It means that the prevalent building type in the Caribbean has a very high embodied energy or carbon cost. It also has high thermal mass. It's not designed to minimize unwanted heat gain or utilize passive cooling solutions. In fact, what this means for most of the buildings that we have in Jamaica now is that they require constant cooling in order to remain at a tolerable internal temperature. So for our next project, we would like to go on to look at building construction materials. And quick break to commercial here. If the CDB or any other funding agency involved listening to this would be interested, please get in touch because we would love to hear from you and see if we can get some funding for the research and development that would be needed. Sorry about that, Doug. I just thought I'd take that opportunity. Many thanks for your time and attention. Back to you.
Many thanks, and a fascinating subject. I'd love to see the building actually, and I'm sure many of the participants would as well. A couple of questions coming through. Given that this was a little bit of a first for the region, I think it is the first for the region, how did you approach the market to get the necessary design, construction engineering and contractors on board? How was that approached in terms of the market engagement? And did you seek to promote the innovation from the private sector, or was it more driven by design from your side?
We decided, and in hindsight, this was, I think, a mistake. We decided to follow Government of Jamaica procurement guidelines. That we found was enormously onerous, time-consuming, and it meant that we probably ended up with a less than ideal combination. However, the basic idea was that we went to market, we put out the design specs, and we asked architects initially to tender, and then we went out to ask construction firms to tender. In hindsight, I think that's doing it the hard way, because a lot of the expertise that you would want to make use of simply isn't there, or it's held by very few people. So going through the open tendering process is fine if you have enough competition in the marketplace. And if you don't, then it would actually probably be better to consider going for something like sole source. But if you want to utilize the government procurement process, which we did, because we thought there was an important principle that we should demonstrate that it could be achieved through a standard procurement process. But in some respects, it does mean given the current state of awareness and market conditions, you may end up with a less than ideal result.
Thank you. And I'd like to invite some of the other panelists to come in with questions. Dr. Clark, I don't know if you want to come in, because I know you were unfortunately cut off in the last session. Agnes, I don't know if you're able to open the mic of Dr. Clark. I'm having some problems doing so. I believe
Yes,
it's open.
Yes, yes, I am back. Just to conclude the last question that was asked of me concerning how does one get started, I would say that while there's no prescribed mechanism, I would suggest that countries take advantage of the passions and the enthusiasm of the ministries of energy, the ministries of the environment, and the standards bureaus within each country. And those folks have the passion; they will do it. And from that, you can use them to get over to your procurement professionals.
Thank you. And Josh, could I invite you to come in on that presentation?
Yeah, so Professor Clayton, obviously very interesting topic. One question I would ask is going back to the bullet center, which I don't know how many people use this term, but I've always used the term blue building. It goes beyond green, right? It actually supplies more energy back to the grid than it ever uses, right? It also does the same for water. They had a unique agreement with the city of Seattle that they were able to capture rainwater for all their uses. Do you think the Caribbean's in a unique place to provide a lot of blue buildings, especially from a water perspective, which obviously have impact on energy as well, but a lot of rain capture and supplying that back to the grid as well?
Yes, we did that. I didn't touch on this aspect in the presentation, but we did two other things with the building. One is that we built in water harvesting and a grey water system. So we have rainwater which is being used for things like flushing toilets in the building, and then we have a rainwater runoff system so that the water is filtered down through a gravel bed before it goes back down into the water table. If we, in the next phase, we might look at things like water purification, so return the water to something like potable quality or for high use values. The other third thing that we did is think about how the building could be made earthquake and hurricane resilient, because the projections for climate change indicate that in the Caribbean we may have more severe storms, shorter latency in between major hurricanes in future. So it is actually extremely important to think about how you can make buildings more autonomous with regard to both energy and water, plus make sure that the building itself can survive a major incident to ensure the safety of the occupants. People die during hurricanes mainly as a result of flooding. About 90% of the deaths are due to flooding rather than flying debris. So you have to look at water management issues and location issues. The uncomfortable fact, and this is something that no government in the Caribbean has really started to deal with yet, including St. Vincent and the Grenadines. But the fact is we have to start to think about relocating some of our centers of population and infrastructure out of areas which are likely to become more vulnerable in the years ahead. So when you look at the larger picture, it's not just about building design, it's also about urban planning and deciding where people should be living in future. All of this is really has to be considered as part of one integrated approach to the problem of how and where people are going to be living in a couple of decades from now.
Thank you, Professor Clayton. We're going to, given the time constraints, we're going to have to move on to Josh's presentation now. And I have noted there's a couple of other questions which are coming in, and we'll try to pick those up in the wrap-up session.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. I'm not going to be able to get to my full presentation, so that the slides will be here. Obviously, Agnes will have them to hopefully be able to send out. My one main point to folks is what Professor Clayton and Dr. Clark have spoken about is incredibly important. Please don't take any of my presentation to say otherwise. Our operational carbon impact is incredibly important. We still need to lower that. What keeps getting forgotten, though, and has for decades, it's not anything new, is our embodied carbon. How much energy it takes to produce the products that we are using. In the next 30 years, it's shown, Architecture 2030 has done a study that's shown it's almost half of our carbon impact on the environment is going to be from this embodied carbon. So think about it. You're building your building out of concrete and steel, say in the Caribbean, to account for some of the concerns that Professor Clayton mentioned. And very rightfully so, but those things are incredibly energy intensive to make. So we talk about things like scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Again, I'll leave this slide up for a second. These are all the different greenhouse gas emission areas that can come in. Scope 1 and 2 are basically the creation by an organization. Scope 3 is that indirect emissions. A lot of organizations in the Caribbean, most of your impact isn't going to be from the energy you use because of the wonderful trade winds that you typically have. You don't typically have the heating costs that some of the rest of us have in the world. You do have air conditioning costs, but your scope 3 you're purchasing is where your greenhouse gas impact really is. So there's a couple ways you can start to get this information. As Dr. Clark mentioned, trust existing sources of information. There's something called environmental product declaration, which is exactly what it sounds like. It helps translate a product's environmental impact, including something called global warming potential, or GWP. We love our acronyms in sustainability, so please get used to them. There'll be lots of them. Email us. We'll hopefully be able to translate some of these. This is what they look like. There are thousands of them around the world. We have some at UL that we verified for companies. Lots of different products, from steel to concrete to flooring to gypsum board to insulation, all on down the road. Look for these environmental product declarations, because they're going to tell you what impacts along the lines of their embodied impacts. So that global warming potential that it takes to create a sheet of gypsum board, for example, that you see here. So they give you all of that information so you can start making choices about selecting the best embodied concept. The other way is organizations are now starting to share and understand information across their supply chain. So certain organizations, if they don't have an environmental product declaration, ask them if they have their scope 1, 2, or 3 greenhouse gas data. Some may have that, some may have it and not want to give it to you, but push them a little bit. One thing I like to try and remind procurement professionals about is you hold all the power because you hold the money. I understand the days it feels like Sisyphus, like you're pushing the rock up the hill every single day and it's rolling down over you at the end of the day for asking for data and people aren't giving it to you, but you hold the money. You have the money, manufacturers need the money. So therefore, keep asking for data. So ask for an environmental product declaration on products, building products. That'll help you get global warming potential information. Or ask if they have scope 1, 2, or 3 greenhouse gas emissions data. This can help start to give you a broad range of information where you can start to make selections. So Doug, there's a lot more there, but obviously recognizing time, I want to make sure we get time back for questions from the audience.
Thanks, Josh. It's a very rich area for discussion, of course. Quick question. Embodied carbon, which you were speaking to, have you seen that being built into evaluation criteria and done successfully?
Yeah, in fact, the state of California now has a requirement for environmental product declarations for 4 types of products: steel, structural steel, steel rebar, flat glass, which is windows, and mineral wool board insulation. Please don't ask me why it's that specific insulation. Politics. It's a fun discussion that we can have a different day. But they got EPDs for a number of years, and now the state has set a maximum global warming potential limit on those 4 products based on EPDs. And now they will not buy products for the state of California with state of California taxpayer money that are not below those global warming potential limits. So there is starting to be a movement. The state of New York state of Washington, Illinois, a number of different jurisdictions in the United States are going down this, starting this process. And little bit of a preview, now that the United States can actually say global warming and climate change again, thank you, as a governmental agency, our federal government may start to implement global warming potential, looking at it in federal procurement, which should help the entire region, obviously, hopefully.
Thank you, Josh. And I think the catalytic effect of public procurement, which is referenced earlier, is particularly important in this regard. We have a couple of other questions, and I'm very mindful we've only got a few minutes left. We have a question on, while the focus is on the procurement managers, are there considerations for key members of staff in developing the relevant specifications? And I think this may go back a little bit to what Dr. Clark was saying earlier. I don't know if you want to take that, Dr. Clark.
Yes, thank you for the question. The manual itself gives guidance on the specifications themselves. So, with a little bit of help, the procurement managers should be able to copy and paste. First of all, in terms of the standards, the specs are given in the Caribbean Regional Energy Efficiency Building Code. So you can copy and paste that technical information from the manual. In terms of the energy efficient product, and Energy Star is only one label. You go to the Energy Star website, and they give you the language which you could copy and paste into your procurement. Again, let me emphasize that Energy Star is only one. Energy Star gives a sort of medium level of efficiency, but there are some higher levels of efficiency which are out there, but those products are extremely expensive, and one needs to be careful from a cost standpoint.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. Go ahead, please go, Josh. Yeah.
If I may, really quickly, I'm going to put it a little bit differently than Dr. Clark. He's being very polite and giving all that information. My way of saying it is, for procurement professionals, borrow or steal language that you trust. Go to someone else like Dr. Clark. He's giving you an entire manual. Don't feel bad about copying and pasting his work. Call Professor Clayton, ask him how he wrote this, what specs he would change. Go to the city of San Francisco or the state of California, email me. Go to Doug and ask how the Caribbean Development Bank is doing their procurement. Steal from everyone else and what they're doing to start with. As you start to gain your information, then you can start making decisions on your own with your own data. But feel free to borrow and steal. That's what we're all here for, right? We want everyone to get better.
Thank you, Josh. And just to say, we're not shy at CDB about stealing and borrowing either. We recognize there's a whole wealth of expertise out there. And we are going to have to conclude. There's one other question which I'm just going to ask the panel, and perhaps they could think about this and ask and put some responses into the chat. A pertinent question as to, is there any use for the volcanic ash in terms of sustainable building? Maybe that's one the panel could ponder and put some thoughts into the chat box. A very pertinent question, obviously, for St. Vincent at the moment. But at this point, we're really going to have to close out the panel session. I really sincerely thank the panelists. The knowledge that you brought has been fantastic, and there's been a really rich dialogue around the topics. I think this is a topic that we could take further on another day, because there's so many facets to this. So thank you again, all. If we were in a real room, I know we'd all be clapping, but certainly you have the applause from myself, and it was a fantastic session. We're going to turn over to Farid Yakka at this point. Farid is a program officer in the UNEP's Economy Division in Paris. So it's already evening time with him. Since 2008, he's been leading the work of UNEP in the area of sustainable public procurement, and he represents UNEP on the advisory committee of the Global One Planet Sustainable Public Procurement Program. Farid.
Thank you, Doug, and fantastic webinar. I've learned so much. Really, thank you to the panelists. Thank you also for great opening remarks, and to you, Doug, for amazing moderation. And also to our participants who were also active. I'm also happy that this is a joint initiative from CDB, OAS, UNEP, OECS. So I'm always thrilled when we organize things together. We have a long-standing collaboration with OAS, but I think that we're going to develop such hopefully fruitful collaboration also in future with CDB and OECS. It's really already looking good. I think that I learned a lot, as I said. First of all, that sustainable infrastructure is an important area. In UNEP, it's true that we have started in terms of green procurement working with what we call quick wins, but we have to understand and recognize that we have to move to impactful categories, and buildings, construction are impactful categories because we have to tackle existing challenges. However, we have of course, challenges which I'm going to cover, maybe that I heard. But before that, I want to say, why it's important. I heard great figures, that 60 to 67% of the costs of infrastructures were covered by government in developing countries, 40% in developed countries. These are huge figures. So really, governments can influence, and they should make sure that their infrastructures are aligned with their sustainable development priorities. Also, that infrastructures have great impact on SDGs. I think it's maybe the sector that has the largest impact on SDGs. That 1/3 of global final energy was consumed by infrastructure, 40% of GHG emissions, which makes it really important. Helena told us that also the importance of green economy and the number of jobs we could create in green economy, and infrastructures is a large part of green economy. Now, of course, we have issues. We heard from Dr. Clayton, of course, he recalled the challenges of global change, the depletion of resources, land degradation, pollution, etc. We heard also that we have less than 20% of recovery plans are allocated to green initiatives. So this is worrisome. We know that we're only starting. 41% of the participants today said that they hadn't yet embarked on green procurement of infrastructures. We heard that also it's not just an engineering problem, but we need to have building regulations, we need to have education, we need to have a fiscal system, we need to have a demand, we need to have good purchase price for electricity. So we're talking really of a system. So the solutions are not just in building the right buildings or infrastructure, but we need to make sure that the system also is conducive to that. In terms of other challenges, I learned a lot about the fact that construction, and it's the case also in the Caribbean, is still based on cement and steel, which have such a big impact on GHG emissions, 8% for each of these categories. So the idea of the high embodied carbon cost really is one of the key concepts that were presented today, and the fact that these require constant cooling. And I'm talking to Agnes. We have to make sure that in the study we're doing right now in sustainable procurement of construction in the OECS, we make sure that we present also alternatives. We don't work also only on conventional products that we can improve, but let's change, the mindset, and let's see, how, we can procure differently and different types of products for construction. Also, I will finish with that. Then we had great solutions. First of all, Dr. Clark told us about the amazing work they're doing for in developing those the manual, the toolkit for green building procurement for energy systems. We heard about all these norms that are and standards that are coming in place, the building codes, the certification marks for energy efficiency and resource efficiency, the work that CROSC is doing for energy labels. The fact also that we need to have green committees also to support the work of procurement managers. And Josh told us about the importance of EPDs, and it's great to hear that this is really becoming a reality, and embodied impacts are being calculated through EPDs, and in the future there will be a central part of public procurement. It's already happening in California because we have those amazing figures of 49% of the carbon impacts are in embodied carbon. and the need to really ask in the future for scope 1, 2, 3 to get a real figure of the impact. So fantastic webinar. Thank you, Agnes, for your great job in organizing that, putting that together, for the panelists, and for all the hosting organizations, OECS, OAS, CDB, and NCG also, NGP, sorry. Over to you, Doug, and thanks again to all of you.
Thank you, Fareed. I think it's the moment in the webinar where we need to wrap everything up. I just wanted to thank Fareed for his reflections and also for highlighting some of the key points that came up in this very rich webinar. I also wanted to quickly thank our panelists and our moderator, Doug, for the very interesting and engaging discussion. I also wanted to thank our speakers, Rowan and Helena, and of course, the panelists for your participation and also for your engagement in the webinar today. So I just wanted to quickly mention, as I mentioned earlier today, I will be sharing the webinar recording with all of the registered participants, and I will also share the presentations and links to the Green Building Manual and Toolkit. I also wanted to mention that under the joint UNEP and OECS Commission Strengthening Sustainable Pulp Procurement in the OECS project, we are in the process right now of developing SPP guidelines for sustainable construction materials. So those guidelines will be ready and will be published around the summer. So please keep an eye out for that. And with that, thank you once again, and have a wonderful afternoon or evening.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.